Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 39. Alchemy's Forbidden Fruit, a Deadly Cocktail. When the elixir of life backfires. From catalyst to cataclysm. Reaching the end of this phase in this series, 31 to 40, before beginning a new era in the next decade. This decade is poised to end climactically on a couple of developments that were bloody consequential, in line with previous curtain closers at episode 20 and episode 30. Fasten your seatbelts. After the fall of Rome in the West, which was the topic of that last decimal stone article just mentioned, Europe sooner or later fell into what's been called feudalism. This is a phenomenon that might merit a separate treatment on its own, but in essence, it was a system based around a series of lords in lofty castles, lording it over their fiefdoms, with vassals owing fiefs, obligation toward the lord by way of service to him, in return for a livelihood, mostly miserable and somewhat restricted in their options. This development, again simplistically, can be connected to the political power vacuum that ensued in Latin Europe after the disintegration of Rome. Such lords consolidated their power in those mighty stone castles and were aided by petty nobility such as the knights, mounted warriors who had sworn loyalty to "My liege and master, my lord." These castles with their thick walls were strong enough to keep intruders at bay. For a satirical version of this, check out Monty Python's Holy Grail sketch of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The main means of attack from the outside would be the trebuchet, a giant catapult used to sling large projectiles across the walls into the castle, alongside other methods such as battering rams, digging a tunnel under the wall to get through, literally undermining. Part of the measures taken to mitigate or eliminate such intrusion would be by having a moat around the castle, typically a large body of water. So picture yourself a lord in your lofty castle, surrounded by your loyal knights feasting away, roaring fires, whole roasted boars on spits, mead sloshing everywhere, minstrels in the corner. This time around, look up one of the videos depicting this in the Blackadder comedy series. In the good old days, you could be sure that your castle was secure. And now suddenly comes a huge blast, a series of them, blowing a hole in your mighty defenses, shattering your world, literally. This, of course, is gunpowder in action, but it shattered much more than just physical objects, and it wasn't overnight. Let's get to the bottom of it, starting right at the beginning. The Big Bang! Like a few other deadly exports to the West, we have to first go back to China. Picture Taoist monks and priests seeking alignment and harmony with Tao, the source and fundamental principle of the universe. They are in particular seeking to formulate the elixir of life. No, really, they took the quest for immortality seriously. In this endeavor, they were resolute practitioners of alchemy, with of course differences not just in motivation but also methods from the other three areas where it was comparably pursued: India, the Muslim world, and Europe. As one can imagine, the approach was to trying out different combinations of chemicals and carry out a 1,000-year-long clinical trial on subjects under laboratory conditions to categorically confirm the attainment of immortality. Okay, scratch that last bit out. But one day, in the mid-800s, in what I can imagine as a hitherto calm and serene setting of peaceful monks and priests, it blew up. And blew up big time, and not just in the face. This is even documented in a Tang dynasty text that warned of experiments that went catastrophically wrong. Some have heated together sulfur, relgar, and saltpeter. Smoke and flames result, so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even the whole house burned down. I wonder if it then came with a warning, do not try this at home, or anywhere. But yes, the three-element genie was out of the bottle. It's not hard to imagine that the authorities took notice and at some point became increasingly aware of the potential of this explosive cocktail. The first known military use of gunpowder is in 919, with flamethrower-like devices used in battle. The spark was lit. In the early centuries, China did attempt to have a state monopoly on the use and development of gunpowder-based technologies. You can perhaps find parallel with, as we saw in episode 37, their control of paper-making technologies. There was, for example, centralized gunpowder production instituted under the Song dynasty. However, it did soon get out. Spreading like wildfire. A key catalyst in this has been cited as the Mongol conquests of the 1200s, which involved both invading China and taking control of large parts of Central Asia and even beyond. Thus, the technology spread westward, with the Islamic world acquiring mastery of it in the first instance, as documented by a treatise in the late 1200s. One vital point is that these Arabic sources explicitly prove the Chinese origin of the technology, with terms like Chinese snow for saltpeter, the main ingredient, and Chinese arrows for the gunpowder-propelled rockets. Indeed, the term for gunpowder itself was a literal translation of the Chinese fire drug, that originally a bestower of immortality. But unlike in the journey of paper along this route about 5 centuries prior, it quite rapidly arrived in Europe as well. And even though the large Islamic empires of the period made use of gunpowder-related technologies, improving upon what they'd acquired, things really started to heat up once Europe got hold of it. A key difference was a shift in Europe from chemical focus, as was the case in China and the Islamic world, to mechanical, although there were significant chemical or substance breakthroughs as well, notably corned gunpowder in the late 1300s, producing up to 3 times more power than earlier methods. Other areas of refinement were metallurgy and casting, barrel lengthening, and a bunch of intricate mechanics related to the operation of gunpowder-based weapons. But it was not just artifactual technologies that made rapid strides in Europe, but also the institutional ones. And without looking into this, we cannot understand the story of gunpowder, or indeed a great many other developments that hinged on it. Fight fire with fire. So what was different in Europe compared to China or the Islamic world? We can recognize China as an empire here. And as I briefly touched upon, the Chinese state quickly took control of gunpowder-related activities. The Islamic world was also made up mainly of a few large empires, thus mirroring the kind of centralization imposed in China. Europe was a different cannonball game. The feudal reality in Europe meant that it was hugely fragmented, with the power of kings significantly limited by and beholden to the feudal lords. We saw in episode 29 how the barons in England were able to pin down King John to agree to the rule of law as in established custom, the Magna Carta he was made to sign in 1215. The advent of gunpowder upended the entire power dynamic. Firstly, given the decentralized nature of power in Europe, several players had a chance to have a go at this new capability. Because, and whatever our ethical preferences in any such endeavor, once your rivals are working on it, You just cannot sit back and hope for peace and goodwill to all men. So one does get dragged into the arms willy or nilly. And this is literally an arms race. From our perspective of exploring innovation, the point here is that the competitive nature of the European political landscape spurred innovation. But technologically, it was also a very challenging space. We now tend to take the presence and operations of guns and cannons for granted. We've seen them work, in fact, only too well, you might say. It did not come about easily. For a good time in the early days of experimentation, the one operating the cannon was a good deal likely to be killed than who it was intended to. Thus, all of this required and was the result of massive amounts of innovation, chemical, mechanical, and underpinning them, institutional, which panned out in the period between 1320 and 1450 over a series of 4 notable phases. Castles and kingdoms. There was the codification of knowledge and the rise of experts, salaried workers specializing in foundry, powder making, artillery, etc., in quite a contrast to the feudal world of seasonal engagement. And as we saw at the beginning, the traditional castle structure crumbled, literally, in face of gunpowder-driven assault. This then propelled innovation in engineering, in fortification. And these went hand in hand with consolidation of power by kingdoms, wresting that power away from the feudal lords. Because these significant technological and institutional investments required an overhaul in the institutions of state, and were measures only the heads of state could afford. The individual lords could lord it over no more. Thus, the cannonball was the death knell of feudalism. And as we can imagine, this completely changed the face of the battlefield. Gone were the good old days of the knights in shining armor, mounted on their horses, leading the charge and garnering the glory of the spoils of war. With the advent of these far more powerful weapons, the whole institution of knighthood withered. It had become obsolete. Dear Arthur, I write in great admiration of your services to the realm. However, we have now trained a peasant to hold one of these new instruments called the gun. I won't be needing your services anymore. I wish you and your steed well. Yours faithfully. 1377 can be seen as symbolic when the siege of Odruk marks a critical turning point where the efficacy of early artillery helped transform gunpowder from being primarily psychological to demonstrably physical in its effect on the battlefield. This battle was the first overwhelming victory of gunpowder artillery over castle fortifications. But perhaps a grander date in the story of gunpowder is 1453, when it helped not only end the 100 Years' War between England and France, but also led to the fall of a 1,000-year Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, thanks, ironically enough, again, to arms supplied by a deviant Hungarian engineer named Orban, marking a watershed in history. Both aided and abetted by gunpowder. And thus it is that gunpowder, alongside the other earth-shattering event I've promised for the next episode, along with their myriad repercussions and consequences thereof, meant that the Middle Ages were coming to an end, and we'd soon be moving to the early modern era.